light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Occasionally I've been in situations where people want to talk about respect or giving respect or receiving respect. Unfortunately, perhaps, most of the time they're talking about receiving respect. The thing that always puzzled me a little bit about that is the way that a number of people over time actually have insisted that I wasn't adequately respecting them because I disagreed with them. And it kind of limits the entire conversation to what they already believe without allowing for it to be a meeting of the mind, so to speak. In essence, I could learn what they understood, but they wouldn't learn anything. And I couldn't, even then it's limited because I find that I learn a lot by having dialogue with others, but only if I can think freely. If I have to think in the rigid way that their pre-established opinion already specifies, then there are a whole lot of things that I can't discover. Which is actually why I do these shows in an unscripted fashion, because I find when I'm simply following an idea, wherever the train of thought may go, there are things that come up within my shows that I didn't necessarily plan to say. So that as I'm talking and thinking out loud, I'm stumbling onto new insights that I hadn't previously even thought of myself. Which I guess is kind of what we do in graduate levels of academia also. What they like to call deconstructing an idea, which I don't know if I've ever heard the word deconstruct outside of academic settings, but it basically means, to use the metaphor of a car, it means taking the pieces apart and laying them out in a row until you can see all the pieces that make up the car. And well, it has 4 wheels, or 5 if you count the spare tire, and then it has leaf springs, and it has pistons, and it has an engine block, and it has seats, and it has window mechanisms. My car still has the windows that you turn up by hand because, which I guess in that good sense, if I ever do get in an accident, I can roll down the window to get out without starting the car. And so I have more direct control over things. And on one hand, it's not that I want control necessarily, as that I want ways to address any challenge that I encounter. And if I have a manual transmission and windows that roll up by hand, there are solutions that I can employ that are not available within a car with an automatic transition and electric windows. There were a few times, for example, where the starter on my car wouldn't work. Well, in my case, all I had to do was roll it about 15 or 20 feet, and my car's small enough that I could push it myself. So I pushed it, ran around, jumped in, and popped the clutch. And the car started, and I drove home. You can't do that with an automatic car. So that was a way I was able to get out of a difficult situation, specifically because I had a manual transmission. Which is getting harder and harder to find, I understand, because more and more things are going to an automatic transmission car where you can't pop the clutch and start it. You have to sit there in your car and use your cell phone, if you have one, I don't, to call for help and get someone else to come rescue you because your car simply won't go. It kind of reminds me of when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, and there were people waiting on their roofs for days to be rescued because they didn't have the first idea about how to do anything or respond to the situation. And I guess coming back to the word respect, that's where I respect human ingenuity and the intellect and the ability to think. Because if it had been me sitting on one of those roofs, I would have been sitting there for 3 days. I would have begun breaking up the roof or finding anything that was floating by. I would have built myself a raft, and I would have found some way to paddle it to safety, wherever I needed to go. I wouldn't just sit there waiting for someone to do it for me. Because I guess I'm proactive by nature. That whenever I'm encountering a challenge, I immediately start thinking of what can I use or how can I deal with this in a situation that doesn't leave me stuck. that gives me a way of responding. And so in that sense, when people say, if you respect me, you won't disagree with me, I disagree with that even, because if I respect that person and believe in their worth and their ability and all that they could become, then I don't want to encourage them to be no more than what they already are. If I, in a sense, I'm respecting their potential as well as their present capability. And in that sense, I'm seeing them as more capable than sometimes they see themselves as being. And that to me would be a better and more empowering way of defining respect. It kind of goes back to the word faith also. Faith is not just a word for religion and for churches. It's about having faith in yourself and faith in others and faith in the world around you, faith in your community, and figuring out which communities are worthy of faith and which have demonstrated themselves as being unworthy of trust or unworthy, poor recipients of faith that you, how did someone put it? It was ill-founded or misplaced faith, that if you place faith in a community that doesn't value you, when you find yourself in need of virtually any specific thing, the community may decide that you don't count and go on its way and leave you to perish. One of the curiosities, I guess, of living in the United States is that in my understanding, in the 18th century, the word men meant everyone, because it was a patriarchal world, sad to say, but when they said in the founding documents of the United States, all men are created equal, they meant everyone. They didn't just mean the male gender and the female gender can go away, because of course they didn't even mean the male gender, because the question, all men are created equal, was a wonderful sentiment to put on paper, but within even the first manifestation of the United States, black men were not equal, and Asian men were not equal, and Latino men were not equal. And if there had been a recognition of the category, because I don't think there was, gay men were not equal. But in the way the document was written, I read it and understand that it means everyone. And that may be a misinterpretation on my part, but it's the way that I find it to be empowering. So all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights that no one can take away. But of course, the problem since then is that we have spent more than 200 years trying to decide what the word men means. And again, it comes back to this struggle over who are the people who don't count. Well, I believe all lives matter. Everyone counts. A person is a person is a person. And I would take issue with anyone who said otherwise. And so that to me harbors more, it is very much attached to our understandings of respect. And, for that matter, in the history of the United States, if I remember correctly, black men actually had the vote earlier than women had the vote. And of course, at this point, I don't see men and women as being superior or inferior to each other, except perhaps in specific ability. But as persons, as living beings, everyone matters. And everyone deserves respect just as much as everyone else. And it's not about deciding who counts and who doesn't, that the rich people count and the homeless people don't. Everyone matters. And the thing, I guess, in talking about the homeless population, which in my understanding is perhaps larger than it's ever been, because so much of the world has fallen under the economic obsession of the current time, that money is the measure and money matters, and so bankers and lawyers are somewhere near the top of the pyramid of who has the most power. But as I've said too many times lately, when money becomes the measure, relationships always suffer. Relationships with the country, relationships with other, relationships within your church, every relationship suffers when money becomes the measure. And if we go back to each homeless person and recognize that they are not a category, they are people, they're individuals, and every single one of them has a story. And in many cases, it involves a significant misfortune to which their community would not respond. I found it so peculiar when I was in theological school that in all of the classes, all of the discussions I encountered, every single one of them, there was this projection, if you will, that the categories were the definition, and that you really didn't know who you were until you know to which category you belonged. But the more I pondered that, the more I came to the conclusion that there is no individual who embodies a category. There is no white man who can represent all white men. There is no black woman who can represent all black women. There is no Asian child who can represent all Asian children. Every single one is as unique as a snowflake. And every single one of them may be the one who makes the difference at some point in their life. There are discoveries and new approaches and new ways of understanding community that come through individuals. And if that one individual was taken out of the mix, incredible, wonderful things may never happen. And the rest of us would be poor. We just wouldn't know what we missed, but we would be dealing with all the problems resulting from that individual not being able to make his or her contribution. And I guess now we're talking his, her, or their, though I have problems with using their as a pronoun for an individual because it's a plural pronoun. And we used to make the joke when I was in high school, we are not schizo, which by no means is to put down people who deal with the very difficult dilemma of schizophrenia, because that's a whole nother issue to talk about some other time. But I wish, I studied German for 4 years in high school, the German language, and I thought it was a wonderful language in the sense that they do have a pronoun within German language for being neither male nor female. The closest we can come to it in English is to say one likes this, one doesn't like this, one prefers this, one, etc. And even that is somewhat unwieldy in English because English is in many ways a problematic language. But the point being that it's about starting from this basic point of a person is a person is a person is a person after all. Thank you, Dr. Seuss. And from that initial point to say, what can I learn from you and what can you become with my support and my help? And if you don't become all that you can be, humanity will be the poorer for it. And all kinds of wonderful inventions and works of art and computer programs and any number of things will never happen. I think it's still played every year and during the holiday season. One of the timeless movies that is so timeless in its message is Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life, where he gets to see what his life would be if he wasn't there. And the men who died in an accident because his brother wasn't there to save them and he wasn't there to save his brother, and the ripple effect across all of humanity and the way it totally changed the character and nature of his town. Going back to my theological school days, it was frustrating to me that they could only see the categories. And the biggest conflict I had with virtually everyone at the school was because as an autistic who sees details first, for me, identity always began with individuality. Looking in the mirror and closing your eyes and listening to your own heart and figuring out, who am I? And when you begin to answer that question, because it's never fully answered, it changes and evolves and grows throughout life. But when you begin to understand, who am I? And then as I approach spirituality, first within the Roman Catholic Church, then within neo-pagan settings and Protestant settings, Pentecostal settings, all sorts of different settings, that it then became this question of, who am I And in light of that, who are you, God? And I quickly came to the conclusion that whatever is truly divine is not what the church said. And there had to be some quiet interaction with mystery where I mostly just listened and had to be content with the part that could not be known yet, and take as much love and wisdom as I could from the part that I could learn and that I could understand, that I could know. And even, because my initial context was mostly Christian, I used that context a lot to draw out lessons of life and deconstruct, if you will, to perceive the pieces of relationships. And that in some cases, what I am dealing with within another person that I have no way of knowing is what their experiences have been. And that if I'm dealing with a man or a woman, either one, who has experienced domestic violence or molestation or any number of things, that they may not tell me their life story, but the ways that they react to words that I use may very much reflect those stories. And I may say, God is a loving Father, and get a really negative reaction. And I have to stop and ask, why does that disturb you? And then when I hear more of the story, I could say, well, God is also a loving mother. God is also a source of wisdom and love that is beyond human comprehension. And yet, it comes back to this question that we had in theological school that is given the grandiose title of theodicy. Theodicy is basically asking, if God is so good, why are there bad things? And if God is omnipotent, then why doesn't God do something to stop these bad things from happening? And there are so many different things that could be said on that, but the only way the argument holds up is if God is no greater than human thinking. If we consider that God has wisdom that transcends human thinking, then the best I can offer is to grieve with those who have a reason to grieve, and to mourn with those who have a reason to mourn, and to rejoice with those who have a reason to rejoice. And when something terrible happens and grief is the only decent response, and mourning with that person and compassion and sympathy are the only decent responses, to say that spiritually I believe there is a perspective from which this would make sense. I don't happen to have access to that perspective. And so for now, I have to wait and try to trust, try to go on being as good a person as I can be, because I don't understand. And this is horribly painful. And maybe there is a perspective from which it would make sense, but I don't have access to that perspective. And in that, to accept and to integrate and acknowledge the grief and the loss, and hopefully through that process, to find a way that I can pull something good out of it, some deeper understanding, some way that I am empowered by a negative experience, which doesn't make the experience good, but it does mean that I was able to transform a very negative experience into something that ultimately had positive effect. I suppose it's a somewhat overused example, but or in a general overused category, I guess. People who survived the World War II Holocaust, going through these horrible concentration camps where they were essentially scheduled to be killed, and yet managed miraculously to survive. There was one such person who wrote a number of books, a woman who is from the Netherlands. I think her name was Corrie ten Boom, but in one of her books, because she was traveling all over the world giving these lectures and discussions to people who wanted to learn about her experience and how awful it had been, but also what she learned by going through it. And in one of her books she wrote, I think it was called Tramp for the Lord, she mentions that she tries to hold things loosely because it always hurts so much when God has to pry her fingers open. And I still find a wisdom in that, and trying to hold things loosely, but also not so loosely that I lack compassion or a depth of love in the relationships that I have. what few relationships I have, because there are a lot of people who have rejected me for being Sister Who. And yet, as I look back at the Christian Bible in the Old Testament, all these prophets that are so revered now, several thousand years later, but in their times were the outcasts and the social misfits who couldn't do normal, who couldn't be just like everyone else. But they wrestled with deep and difficult ideas and the circumstances of life, trying to find some way of taking the most horrific events and turn it into something that was positive and empowering. That, to me, is the best respect that we can show someone, that when they have gone through something painful, that we do not minimize their pain, we validate it, we recognize it, and at the same time, we encourage them to find in those horrible, difficult, painful moments, by our disagreement, a way of transforming that horribly negative thing into something that is positively empowering. And now may you be blessed with love and peace in the pursuit of your own dreams and in all your dealings with the diversity of humanity around you. Amen. Wait a minute, what is this? It is not what I planned. Will all my hard work go to waste? Must I change the place I stand? And yet there seems to be a light in this new and different way. But I will have to let go of all that I knew yesterday. Remembering wisdom, remembering love, guidance for my footsteps, meaning from above, a tiny touch of heaven that one can think of. Remembering wisdom, remembering love. Each one has a different word, promising I'll be free. How am I supposed to know which one is true for me? The shoes that fit another's feet may not fit my own, and the path that others need to walk may be theirs alone. Remembering wisdom, remembering love, guidance for my footsteps, meaning from above, a tiny touch of heaven that one can think of. Remembering wisdom, remembering love. Who is my true family? Who needs my love and care? What is it I can give to them? What can I truly share? I offer up my very best and let others make the choice, knowing only good will come when the right ones hear my voice. Remembering wisdom, remembering love, guidance for my footsteps, meaning from above, a tiny touch of heaven that one can think of. Remembering wisdom, remembering love. Hands holding hands can hold the world. Hearts holding hearts can live anew. My hand to yours and your heart to mine can make every dream come true. Hands holding hands can hold the world. Hearts holding hearts can live anew. My hand to yours and your heart to mine can make every dream come true.